Good afternoon, everybody. So I'd like to welcome you to I Wrote a Book, Now What? The Advice from the Professionals. Today, we have three wonderful writing professionals, writing, editing, marketing, and so many other things professionals. They have a short bio available in the your little event schedule. And I did want to mention, though the first 45 minutes approximately, we'll be doing pre-prepared questions. During the last 15 minutes, we'll open it up to audience questions. No doubt we will not be able to get to all of the audience questions, so I do hope you will get a chance to stop by and talk to our professionals in person. But if you want to start looking at those little index cards that are on your seats, think about questions you might want to ask, get something written down, and then find a staff member, and they'll bring it up to me during those last 15 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and start with Anita. Tell us a little bit about how and why you got started in your current profession.
Okay. So I am a freelance editor and also a ghostwriter, and I host writers' retreats. And how did I get started? Or why am I doing this? I'm doing this because I love books. And I was working actually where Angie works at Nelson Literary Agency and really enjoying that. And I realized that I wanted to spend most of my time on the craft, helping people with the craft of writing, and also helping people understand why they were getting the rejection letters that I was sending so many of while reading the slush pile. And so I started my editing business to be able to work one-on-one with people, and to, basically to get to read for a living. People say that to me every once in a while. You get to read for a living? Or they say, you have to read for a living? So I think that's it in a nutshell.
Thank you, Anita. Angie?
I am Angie Hodapp with Nelson Literary Agency. We're based in Denver. And this just kind of feels like where I was headed all along. I have a bachelor's degree in English. I have a master's degree in English. And then I attended the Publishing Institute at the University of Denver, where I met Kristen Nelson. We were both students there, and she started her agency the day we graduated from the Publishing Institute. And she said, someday I'm going to hire you. I said, great, you let me know when you're making enough money to make that happen, and I'll come work for you. So in the meantime, I worked in magazines, I worked in educational publishing, and then she finally said, come work for me. And so I've been there just over 8 years now.
Thank you. Mary?
I like to tell people that I actually don't have time to read, which is ironic because I work in marketing with all these authors. I was laid off from my corporate job, and I was actually a corporate librarian, and I have a master's in library science. And along the way, I went back and started doing some sales just to keep groceries coming in. And I was working with someone who was getting started as a speaker, and she self-published a book to sell at the back of the room. And she called me up one day and said, hey, I need help in marketing this. Do you want to help? And I said, I don't know anything about marketing books. She goes, neither do I, so let's just do it. So, and then, bless her heart, she started referring me to other people, to other authors, and the phone started to ring, and everybody said the same thing. Mary Jo told me that you help authors market books. I have 2,000 books in my basement. Can you help me?
Oh, wow.
And I said, and I thought, holy cow, I have a business. And that was about 16 years ago. And so now I work pretty much one-on-one with mostly self-published authors, occasionally some small publishers. And I try to read everybody's book, but ironically, I can't always do it. So I would love to read for a living. But instead, I do Facebook for a living.
No. Thanks, Mary. Okay, so I will rotate the questions so that you're not always first, Anita. So Angie, I'm going to start with you on this one. Do you have any suggestions to writers concerning the editing and revision process?
Let me poll the audience really quickly. Is anybody to the place where they're querying agents? Couple hands, okay. So you've probably heard the general knowledge that your book should be pretty close to perfect before you start querying, right? You might have heard that. There's mixed messaging out there about whether or not you should invest in the services of a freelance editor before you start querying. I would say it's really a case-by-case kind of a thing. If you're part of a critique group, and those of you who were here for the author panel this morning, the idea of critique groups came up, relying on a trusted group of writers to read your stuff and to give you good feedback can get you a really long way toward getting that manuscript ready before you start querying it, before it's ready for an agent or an editor to take a look at it. So I would say go free if you can and get a critique group. However, if you're in a place where you don't have access to a community of writers who can provide that for you, you definitely should talk to an editor. What you want to avoid is having an agent be the first person besides you who's ever seen your work. You've got to get your work out there and find out what's working, where your opportunities are to grow as a writer. And you have to kind of learn to be open to suggestions and feedback. Because as soon as an agent signs you, step one isn't going out on submission. Excuse me. Step one is we're going to revise your manuscript first before you go out on submission. And then you do that, and you go out on submission, and an editor acquires you, and they're like, let's revise the manuscript again. So becoming a good reviser while you're working on your book before you enter a traditional process is just a good practice. It's good exercise for you.
Thank you. Mary?
Well, I really can't speak to the editing part because normally by the time an author comes to me, they're either going through the editing process with a professional editor, which I totally encourage them to do, but they're also looking at either publishing the book, self-publishing, or then submitting to a publishing company. What I encourage people to do more than anything moving forward with their books is to have a clear idea of what their objectives are in publishing to begin with, because marketing is a very long and stressful process, and I can't think of, let me ask you this, are there any authors in this room who actually like marketing? Ooh, there's a few, okay. Most of the time people hate it like fury. And it's a lot easier if your book is really good. And it's so much easier if you hire someone like me that we're working with a really good book. So by all means, go through the process and join the critique groups, take the classes, get a writing coach if you need one, but publish the best book you can because it is going to be so much more easy to market a good book than a mediocre one.
I would kind of echo what Angie said. An important question to consider is whether you are wanting to traditionally publish or self-publish. And if you are planning to query agents, I agree that I always tell people to get a critique group and beta readers first. And then if you still need help, for one thing, it's going to be a lot more fun for me to work on a more polished manuscript, and you just get farther and you get more for your money if you do hire an editor. If you're self-publishing, you're basically assembling your own publishing house team if you really do it professionally. And so I think it is important to have, people who are experts in their fields working on your team there in whatever capacity you can afford, whether it's marketing or the cover design or the editing. Putting that together as professionally as possible. But in either case, I think it needs to go through some other steps before you get there.
Thank you. We're kind of touching on this, so I'm going to go ahead and segue into talking about self-publishing. And Mary, I'll start with this question for you. What about the advantages and disadvantages of self-publishing? I know you work primarily with self-published authors.
I do, and I'm a former president of CIPA, the Colorado Independent Publishers Association, so most of my experience has been on the publishing side, or self-publishing side. What I would say the advantage is that you are not bound by a publisher's decision. You don't have to wait on a decision as to whether or not your book is going to be published. That being said, you do have to assemble your own team, and there are groups like SEPA and publishing companies or publishing coaches that you can hire that will have a team that comes to you. But the most important thing is that you educate yourself so you make good decisions. I know a lot of authors who have gone the route of the vanity presses that someone referred to a site, trying to think of the name of it. If you just Google the term, predatory publishers, you'll find a score of them who will take your money, and you'll end up with a very bad book, and you'll pay thousands of dollars for the privilege. There are very good editors, designers, marketers out there who will help you get your book out there if you decide to go the self-publishing route. I'd say the disadvantage to it is, yes, you do have to become educated. Regardless of either publishing or self-publishing, you still have to market. And a lot of people are under the impression that if they sign with a publisher, the publisher takes care of everything. That's not true. It really is up to you to get a website and an online platform and get out there and circulate in order to get interest going on your book.
Thank you. Anita?
Sure. I think that really covered it well. One of the other things I guess I would bring up about an advantage of self-publishing that has come up a couple of times for me recently. I worked on this book project, which it was written for a charitable foundation, and the person that it's honoring is elderly. She's in her 90s, and her health was not great. And so we were asked to write this book, and they wanted it yesterday. If you're going through the traditional publishing process and you are on a very tight timeline, sometimes that can be pretty tricky. So one of the advantages is you control the timeline, and you can make it happen as quickly as you can do it. It kind of comes down to how much control you want, and also that can be an advantage, but it can also be the disadvantage where you have, in traditional publishing, you have a team, an agent and your publishing house team who have kind of got your backs the whole time, and they're doing a lot of this for you. So it's kind of a personality thing a lot of times, whether you think you want the control or not.
Thank you.
And I would add to that, another benefit of going the self-pub or indie pub route is you can turn on a dime. You can really keep your eye on who your readers are. And they're not always who you think they're going to be when you started writing the book. Keep an eye on romance authors, because romance authors have historically and statistically dominated the publishing market if we're looking at dollars. They have always been the biggest slice of the pie. Go Jenny! They have also been the largest exodus from traditional publishing. And many of them are doing wonderfully well in the indie sphere. And it's because they are marketing geniuses, and they pay attention to what their readers want, and they deliver it time after time. So if you haven't met Jenny in the back in the pink, who is one of our successful romance authors locally, please take the time to meet her after the panel.
Thank you.
Yep.
So kind of building on that, and I'll start with Anita on this question. Let's talk a little bit about marketing and when an author should think about marketing in the process. Is there a good time to approach an agent and or publisher and or marketer?
Yeah, I get this question a lot, and I think it came up just as much in my previous work in traditional publishing. A lot of times people get really concerned about this and having their platform set up and how am I going to market this book? And the first draft is still in progress. And so I think it's great to start researching this early on, start thinking about who might make a good agent, whether you see this book going the traditional route or indie publishing. But it can also be a really good way to procrastinate finishing your final draft of this book. So I think it's just important to manage that and to keep the primary focus on getting the writing done when that's where you are in the process.
Thank you. Angie?
And I'll echo that. Focus on writing the best book you can first, and then worry about marketing. Again, there is value in understanding what the process is going to look like for a writer. If being a professional writer is really the career you want, and understanding that marketing and promotion is going to be a big part of where you have to spend a lot of your energy once you're a published author, but you've got to get the good book written first. Write the book. So from the traditional side, I read a ton of query letters every week. And we get the query letter that's like, here's a little about my story. Now let me tell you how many Twitter followers I have and how many friends I have on Facebook and what my plan is to help you support my book in the market. You're not ready to have that conversation yet. So when you're querying, leave that stuff out. It's really about the quality of your book. And for us, and this isn't true for all agents, this is just for us, we're not so much concerned with whether you have a website set up when you're querying or whether you have Twitter followers when you're querying. If we take you on, we're going to make sure you get your website up and hopefully get you some support there. But the minute we sell your book to an acquiring editor, that's when marketing starts. So if we sell your book into Penguin Random House, your acquiring editor is already talking to people on their side. They already are assigning a publicity person, a promotions person. They're already putting together a plan for your book to get your book into the hands of paying readers. So you'll start doing some marketing things well before your books actually hit the shelf, which can be kind of exciting.
Fantastic. Thanks. Mary?
Yeah, there is a huge advantage in having your platform at least sort of in place by the time your book comes out. And I think the situation is different. What you described, I think, is great if you are actually working with a publisher. If you're going indie, it's a little more on you. And much as I would love to have people say at the beginning of their manuscript that they're starting their platform, 99% of the time they wait until they're probably at least through the first edit. And sometimes it's, oh yeah, my book was published last month, what can you do to help me? So you kind of want to strike a nice balance in between those two. But more importantly, have a good idea too of what your objectives are in publishing in the first place. Over the years, I've noticed 3 different types of people. And, at the bottom, not at the bottom, but at, the minimum, would be the person who has always wanted to write this one particular book. It's a passion project. And once it's published, it's kind of the end in itself, that the book is out, and maybe a few people have bought it, and that's fine. They might do a little bit of marketing, but not a hell of a lot. And then in the middle might be the person who's still writing, they're writing on the side, maybe they still got a full-time job, and maybe they're putting out more than one book, and they're doing everything is part-time. And then there's the person who is determined to do it as a full-time endeavor. So where you are on the scale kind of determines how much time and resources you're going to put into your marketing. One good example, I actually worked with a girl who was 14 putting out her first book. And she kind of thought, I've arrived, all I've got to do is put it out there. And I said, well, you take piano lessons, right? And she said, yeah. I said, well, how long have you been taking piano lessons? She goes, 5 years. And I said, are you ready for a concert tour? And she kind of like, well, no. And I said, okay, that's your process of being an author is like that too. You've got a little bit more to learn, and there's a lot of resources. And right now, basketball practice is competing with putting out this book. So know what you're willing to commit to and how much time and effort, and that's really going to determine a lot of your marketing. At the very least, yeah, you need a website. Yeah, you need social media following. Yeah, you've got to do outreach to bloggers and all those good things. But know how much time you're willing to put into it, because that's also going to determine, what level of success you're going to have. And so for some people, just having it out to friends and family is enough, and other people they want to swing for the fences and get published by the big five. That's okay, but know where you want to be.
Excellent, thank you. All right, so Angie, I'll start the next question to you. Considering the vast number of books being published across multiple formats every day, what advice would you give to authors to begin to distinguish themselves in their writing?
Ooh, tough one. How many of you have heard the advice, write the book that you would want to read? Yeah. There's kind of these two different approaches. I hear a lot of writers say, well, I want to write what's going to sell, so they'll chase a market. So is that good advice? Vampire books are big, I'm going to write a vampire book. It can be. I would say if you're if you're going to market chase, understand that you might not be fast enough to catch up with the tail end of it, and you might fall off the back of the bus. Understand that what publishers are buying today isn't going to be on shelves for 18 months. So what editors are already tired of reading is what's kind of hot today. So market chasing can be a bit of a risk, and it can also hurt you because it might not be what you're actually passionate about writing. So I kind of tend to lean towards write what you really love to write. And it's pretty evident on the page when an author is writing something that they love versus something that they think is going to sell, or that they hope, when it's just a commercial pursuit. And I think Peg mentioned that on the panel earlier. So on our client list, we have several authors who have kind of dipped their toes into various genres. And, okay, well, this is hot right now. I think I'll write a dystopian trilogy. And they may or may not do well with that. But the books that traditionally do really well are the books that were written because the author loved them. So be true to your heart.
Thank you. Mary, thoughts?
I think that's terrific advice, because I do run into people now and then who say who are following the trends, and sometimes the result is kind of a mediocre book. But I think what's really important is to know who the book is for. I just started working with a book on sacred geometry. Okay, it's kind of, it's an ancient art, kind of like feng shui, but not quite, but it's the way the master builders built, in ancient times. Who is it for? Certainly not the average person who is maybe a feng shui aficionado. But what my job is to find exactly who is going to be interested in that. And it may be a very limited market, but it's a brilliant book. It's a beautiful book. I guess the bottom line is not every book is meant to be a bestseller. And, your job as an author is to write your passion and come up with a good book. It may be a very limited market, but that's okay.
Thank you. Anita?
I don't have a lot to add to that, but I think in the original question it was about how to stand out. And yeah, I would echo that if you're writing a book that you are passionate about, not only will that hopefully show in the writing of the book and in its quality, but it will also show in the way you interact with your audience. So, if you're truly enthusiastic about your book and you love it, you're going to be able to, that's going to come through when you're interacting with people on social media and all of that. And so that authenticity kind of pervades the whole process.
Oh, thank you. Great thoughts. All right, so Mary, I'm going to start this question to you. With all the different opportunities for self-publishing or going traditional routes or, all of those different things, how does a writer identify the right path?
I think there's going to be some indicators along the way. A lot of people do start out with the idea that they'll get signed by a traditional publisher. And that's an okay way to start, certainly. But you do need to get an agent, and you do need to, do the steps that are going to get you down that path. And maybe, I think the reason a lot of people turn to self-publishing is out of frustration. But there's also the reason as to why they're publishing in the first place. Because if you're a business consultant, for example, and you just want a book that you can give your clients, you may not be interested in selling it, then certainly the indie way is the way to do it. Or if you are a speaker and you want to sell books at the back of the room, it's not as important to you to go the traditional route. It all comes back to what are your objectives in publishing in the first place. And I think you just have to be very clear going into something like this. What are your reasons for doing this? Instead of just simply, I want to publish a book, it's more, what is this book? What is the market for it? How are you going to sell it? And, that's going to determine a lot of that for you.
Thank you. Anita?
Yeah, I very much agree with that. And I think it can depend on your objectives for the book and some of the constraints you have, or especially as I mentioned before, when it comes to timing. For example, I worked with an author who is a survivor of the Columbine shooting, and the anniversary of that, as everyone probably knows, was last Saturday. And so she wanted it to be finished. She wanted her book to be out by then, and she also wanted it coincided with the anniversary of the company that helped rebuild her shoulder after that injury. And so there were a lot of reasons why it needed to be done on a very short timeline. And she also wanted to be able to really pay homage to that organization that helped her, not in a promotional way or anything like that, but she was able to control all the language about that, whereas if it had been a traditional publisher, they might have said, or you might be, saying a little too much about this company or something. She wanted to have full control of all the details and use it as a platform for her speaking career. So I think it comes down to, you can also look to people that you admire, authors you admire, and see how they're doing it and whether their path fits what would work for you. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think the cool thing about being in publishing right now and being a writer right now is you don't have to choose one or the other. You can be a hybrid author. You can write your own books and self-publish them while you're seeking a traditional deal. Or you can be very active in getting traditional contracts and decide to publish something write and publish something different on the side. One caution, if you are a traditional author, make sure your contracts state that you are allowed to write your own and publish on the side, because a lot of publishing contracts might prevent you from doing that. And having a good agent who knows how to negotiate that contract on your behalf is important. I am going to do a little marketing and promotion right now. So I'm selling a book here today called Do You Need a Literary Agent? And I self-published it.
Good for you.
The answers are in there.
Yay. And my goal in writing this is not to tell you you need one. It's to educate you about what the traditional process looks like, what an agent should be doing for you, what they shouldn't be doing for you, so that you can decide for yourself and your book and your audience if a traditional path is right for you or not. So being informed is step one. And yeah, either way, if you're going to go traditional or indie, you want to be in a position where you're calling most of the shots. So learn what your rights are and how to manage them.
Thank you.
I want a copy of your book.
All right, so Anita, I'm going to ask you the next question about the role of persistence in the goal, in the road to becoming a published author. How does and a kind of a follow-up segue to this, how should a writer know when to keep going with a project or when to set it aside and try something else?
That's funny. I've actually been thinking about proposing that as a title for a workshop, and conferences, but I didn't have time to distill it into 30 seconds. But yeah, that's well, I guess it also depends on if we're talking about persisting as a writer or persisting with a certain project. Did it say in the question?
I think it's just the question of persistence as becoming a published writer, how that works.
I think everybody can probably, all of us here can probably come up with some examples of people who persisted, and we all know those stories of authors who, they were just about to give up. In fact, an author that I worked with, I always think this is the sweetest story because she had had a literary agent. She had had her books pitched. They'd been out on submission, and she never got anything published. And all of a sudden, her agent told her she was leaving the business, and she had to start over. But she had this one book that was really needing to be written. It just needed to come out. And so she decided to pour her heart and soul into that. But at some point, even her mother said, "Honey, do you think it might be time to let this go?" She'd seen her go through this for so long, and so many disappointments that even her biggest fan was telling her, maybe it's time to step back for a bit. But instead, she moved in with her mother and finished the book, and it sold for a ridiculous amount of money, and she got the movie rights. It's out in every country, so she, in other words, it's a good thing she persisted. So I think that's not a question I can answer. It's only you have to kind of listen to your own gut. But when it comes to a specific book, sometimes it can help to set that project aside if you feel like it's not going anywhere anymore. Work on something else, and you may end up coming back to it, and it might be its time. That was long.
That was great. That was great. Angie?
How many of you are moving back in with your mother? My mom's here. I'm coming home, Mom. I'm gonna make some money. Yeah, I think that's really good. Like, there are those wonderful stories of how persistence paid off, and cling to those, but also give yourself some distance from your projects. So Stephen King, he writes a manuscript, he puts it in a drawer for 6 months and writes something else, and then he goes back to the drawer, and then he can read what he wrote with fresh eyes. And then it becomes very clear, obviously, these 6 chapters need to go, and that character is unnecessary. And then that revision becomes clearer, and then it becomes, it just simplifies the process to give yourself a little distance. Also, ABC, always be creating. We get query letters from, we get one author querying us for years for the same book. Every couple of months, we get that query letter for that same book. I mean, so often that we recognize, here's a query letter for so-and-so, still the same book. Write something different. If you're not getting the response that you're hoping for, then write something different. Change tacks. Be flexible. Explore a little bit.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mary?
Yeah, I remember this. I had a Stephen King story, too. Apparently, he threw Carrie away, and his wife kept one copy. And eventually, it made its way to a publisher. I really appreciate the other panel talking about, the books under the bed, because there are books that probably don't need to see the light of day. And a really good editor told me once that every writer worth their salt has a few manuscripts that they're never going to publish. And so, yeah, I would concur with the other ladies that definitely you've got to keep moving and don't pin all your hopes on one book, because if you've written a book that literally does not have any discernible market, you're going to have a tough time selling it. And you probably shouldn't put your eggs all in that one basket. Yeah, keep writing.
Fantastic, thank you. All right, so Angie, I'm going to start this question for you. Can you give us an example of a success story, that was an unexpected surprise?
Gosh. I'm thinking back to when Anita was at the agency. I want to talk about Jamie Ford's Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet. Has anyone read that? Mm-hmm. So that's a book that Jamie is one of our clients at Nelson Agency. And Anita actually pulled that. You didn't?
That was right before yeah.
I always thought you pulled that one out of the slush pile. So I won't talk about that one. Totally irrelevant. I will, okay, I'll tell you this story. Kristen came to Pikes Peak Writers, which is a conference happening here in Colorado Springs next weekend. So she was a visiting agent taking pitches, and she took a pitch from a very young 19-year-old first-time author. I think she was 19. Well, I won't let the truth get in the way of a good story. So she, pitches this book, and Kristen's like, hey, this is really awesome, and she signs the client. And the book didn't sell. So she took it out on submission to all these editors. No one wanted it. So Kristen says, well, what else you got? Well, I kind of got this idea for this dystopian YA thing. This is 10, 12 years ago. All right, Kristen says, well, go ahead and write that. And that was Marie Lu, and that became the Legend trilogy. And then she wrote another New York Times best-selling trilogy for young adults, and then she wrote a best-selling duology for young adults. Guess what happened with book one? We just sold it. So that was kind of fun and unexpected, and Kristen went back to the editor who had originally rejected it and said, hey, do you want to see this book from Marie Lu? Yeah, I totally want to see that book. And so she read it. Oh, this is amazing. She's like, yeah, you rejected this. She's like, oh. Oopsie. So yeah, it's always kind of fun to come back full circle on something like that.
That's nice.
Yeah, it's so hard to come up with marketing success stories because a lot of times they happen way after I've stopped working with people. But I'll go back to an oldie but a goodie that actually was one of the beginning books of being self-published, and that was What Color Is Your Parachute? And if you're not really aware of that, it was written by an Episcopal minister who was out of work. And apparently the church was letting ministers go at the time, and there were a lot of unemployed clergymen around. And he published this book for them, and he was literally hand-selling it. And it's now in its, 40th incantation or version, whatever. And it just goes to show that even something that looks like it would be for a very limited market has the ability to go way beyond. Another one that happened with that is the Celestine Prophecy, where the guy literally was selling copies out of the trunk of his car. And he eventually sold it to Warner Books after he had sold like 100,000 books. Can it happen now? I don't know, because we've gotten to a point where the market is so much bigger that you really do have to find something unique that you can do, especially online. I don't think selling out of your car is going to quite cut it anymore. Good example might too be 50 Shades of Grey, which started as fan fiction for Twilight. And it just goes to show that that things can happen in unexpected ways. By the way, if you ever want some good laughs, go to Goodreads, go to 50 Shades of Grey and read some of the reviews. They were brutal.
She has a new series coming out.
She does, and she's actually being listed on Amazon in the literary fiction category. Go figure.
Wow.
I was kind of shocked by that.
Maybe she's learned over the years.
I hope so. But I ain't hoping.
Anita,
too hard.
I'm not sure I have a lot to add. I had a lot of, I guess when I was reading The Slush Pile, when I didn't pull Jamie Ford out of it.
I've told that story so many times.
Oh, I love that. Go ahead. Keep it up.
Keep telling, it's a great story.
But I did, it's the kind of thing like everything that you read in. I never got tired of reading The Slush Pile. I'm jealous that Angie still gets to, because you never knew, any one of them could be that surprise story, and there was, I did have one where it was someone who, I think, I had read the summary and it was really cool and I was like, wow. And then it said, I'm a 16-year-old author, and I was like, okay, well, I'm still gonna go for it. And that ended up being a big success story. His name was Stefan Bachman, and he had a middle grade series that did very well. But so you just never, yeah, you never quite know.
Yeah. Excellent, excellent. Okay, so you guys have just blazed through these questions. Well done there. That means we'll have extra time to take audience questions. Yay! So if you have your little card, if you'd please fill out your card, and then I would be happy to read questions. I've got one last prepared question, and then so if you find a staff member, they'll bring everything up to me. Okay, so, and I'll start with you on this one, Mary. What advice would you give to aspiring authors? And is there a difference, you touched on this briefly, but is there a difference if the author intends to publish one piece versus if they intend to make a professional career out of writing?
Yes and no. I think the bottom line for anything, for all of us in various capacities in publishing, is publish a good book. So really learn your craft. Yeah, there's a lot of junk out there that's made some money, but it's junk. So you might get some momentary success with a 99-cent Kindle book, but unless that's your purpose, I'd say really take the time, hire the writing coach, join the critique group, learn a little bit about the publishing process, and really become a student of it when you're jumping into it, because it really is a whole new profession that you're looking to enter. And you will find it much easier to navigate if you actually have some knowledge going in.
Thank you. Anita?
I actually don't know that I have a lot to add to that.
Write a good book.
You said it. Yeah, that's, it still always comes back to the starting where you need to start, which is perfecting your craft and doing your best work. And then from there, everything else falls into place with a lot of hard work. But yeah, that's where to start.
Okay. Angie?
And I'd say two things. One, throw it out of your head that there's such a thing as the lone creative genius. Like, we have this idea that we didn't really create the thing if we asked for help, or if we had to get feedback and incorporate it. There's no such thing as the lone creative genius. I was just on a panel with Donald Moss, who's a longstanding literary agent. I didn't feel worthy. He's awesome. But he says good art doesn't happen in a vacuum. You got to get yourself out there and be vulnerable. And the second thing, I'm going to make you all repeat something with me. Ready? I'm going to be rejected. Learn to embrace that. It's okay. Everybody gets rejected. Get used to it. There's a local writer who has like a rejection club. Where it's like, how many rejections did you guys rack up this week? Come on, guys, because that means you're submitting and you're getting your work out there. So just get past the idea that that's a scary, vulnerable thing and do it anyway.
Thank you. We've got a lot of great questions up here. Some of them are kind of nuts and bolts questions, and then some of them are more philosophical sorts of questions. I'm going to start with the nuts and bolts, and I'll throw this out to you all and whoever wants to dive in. What is it really meant by a platform? What constitutes a platform?
Oh, I taught a class on this. Platform it's more than just how many Twitter followers you have. It really encompasses everything you've done practically up to this point, because it's the people that know you and respect you. It's the contacts that you've made throughout the years, whether it's your friends from grade school, it's your alumni association, people you've worked with, because these are the people who could potentially lead you into the next speaking gig or the next writers conference where you're a featured speaker or a literary agent or whatever. So it's everybody you've ever met, but it's also the platform you create for yourself online. And it's the website. It is the size of your mailing list. And if you're not putting together a mailing list, I'm begging you, please do a mailing list. It's your followers on Twitter, of course, and Facebook and everywhere else, but it's the activities you're doing. It's also a cause if you have one, because that will help distinguish you. So if you have a cause, like one author I'm working with who actually started a foundation to help people who are running nonprofits in third world countries, that makes her very distinctive. So if you are an author who writes about, human trafficking was a brilliant one, because it is such a horrible thing that, needs light shed on it. So have a cause, but also take really good stock of all the connections that you have, because all of that does make up your platform.
Thank you. Anyone else want to touch that one? No? All right.
That's everybody.
So there's actually a couple of questions here on finding resources for finding an agent. How do you get your book to the right agent?
Buy her book.
Exactly. She's got a book for that.
I'll throw out a couple of suggestions I have. One is if you're on Twitter, there was a really cool movement called MSWL, Manuscript Wish List, where agents started using that hashtag, like, I really wish someone would send me a manuscript that, and that became a website. So you can now go to Manuscript Wish List and search. Agents have pages on that website. You can see what they're looking for. Another suggestion is go to, know your genre, find books that are already published in your genre and read the acknowledgments section, because a lot of writers acknowledge their agent. So that's how you can find out what agent repped that book, and then you send your query to that agent. Hey, I see you represented Stephen King. I think readers of Stephen King would also enjoy my book, and here's my query letter. Publishers Marketplace is a place where you can go and search agents and what deals they've done lately, who they've sold books to, what genres are they most active in, what foreign rights have they been selling, what film TV deals have they done. So that's Publishers Marketplace. Remember that the last word on submission guidelines is going to be found on that agent's website, because submission guidelines kind of change, and some of those big conglomerate websites don't always update in real time. So really peruse the agent's websites as you're compiling your list of dream agents before you query.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Anybody else? She got it. She nailed it. Okay, so there are a few questions about things like individual services that authors pay for when they self-publish. And I think Mary's probably... Can you give kind of a laundry list, perhaps?
A laundry list of people you're going to need?
Exactly.
Okay. First off, an editor. So yes, there are different types of editing, anywhere from content editing down to copy editing. So if you think your manuscript needs work, definitely work with a content editor to make it better. And please don't think that you don't need one, because Stephen King has an editor. So definitely look at that. You need a professional cover designer. Mm-hmm. Do not have your kid, even if they get A's in art, design your cover. Also look at interior design, and which could be the same person who does your cover. Because even though it doesn't seem like you really need someone to lay out black and, just type, there's an art to it. And if it is badly laid out, or if you use Microsoft Word or something, it's very, very obvious. It's very hard to read. You might also need someone to build your website. Now, sometimes you do have a talented teenager in the house who can help with that, but you also need to know what it needs to say. So that's where a marketing person might come in handy. Let's see, that's a lot of it. If you don't know anything about printing, a lot of times there are resources available online, print on demand versus putting it on an offset press. Do you need an audiobook? Do you need an ebook? You know, these are all services that, a publishing consultant could help you with. How's your social media skills and your computer skills? So there could be more, but, there are people out there. And sometimes in the case of computer skills, maybe there are free classes at the library. But if you're not good on a computer, or if you're a little technophobic, definitely get some lessons on how to be more comfortable with that. Because the day is long past where you can get away with saying, oh, I never touched the computer. My 94-year-old uncle who just recently passed away might have been the last guy who never used a computer. And if you're in my age group, yeah, I wasn't born with a mouse in my hand either, but I learned, and if I can learn, so can you.
Excellent, thank you. So a little bit more broadly, if you've self-published and you want to become go with more traditional or do a hybrid, what does that path look like?
I would say at the query process, feel free to be honest about the fact that you've had some self-publishing experience, that you've got books out there. Generally, you're going to want to be querying something new, unless the book that you self-published is out there selling millions of copies, like Hugh Howey's Wool, for instance. He originally started self-publishing that, and the success was through the roof. So we took him on, thanks to my mother, who discovered him on Kindle and called me at 3 in the morning and said, read this guy. And then I called Kristen and I'm like, read this guy. And we ended up talking to him, and he's still one of our clients. So he retained his ebook rights, which was great, and we took care of everything else and continue to do that for him. So yeah, you can be honest in your query letter about what traditional or self-publishing success you've had. What you don't want to do is, I don't know what I'm doing. I sold 3 books. My book isn't very good. No self-deprecation. We lead with our strengths, right? So yeah, but it's okay to be a hybrid author. So don't worry so much. I think probably 5 years ago, you were kind of told to keep your self-publishing under the rug when you were trying to get an agent. You don't have to do that anymore.
Nice, excellent. Any other thoughts?
I'm just wondering, when you read a query letter nowadays, how, it's great if your self-published book had some awards or anything like that, but when it comes to like sales numbers, what level does it take to impress, and below that you just don't mention it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I sold 100 copies last year. It might be really awesome for you. It depends on what year, like what Mary was saying earlier. It depends on where your goalposts are.
Right.
But if you're wanting a traditional deal, we want like maybe 1,000 copies a week, right? We want to know that there is a big, hungry audience for what you're writing.
And actually, I've got a follow-up question for that is, if you have self-published and you're trying to go the traditional route now, how important is it to bring up what kind of a platform you have online?
Yeah, I would say if you're querying as a debut, which kind of clarifies a comment I made earlier, it's not so important that you've got platform yet. But if you're coming to us with your query letter and you have a track record already, you've got a career already started, at that point we are going to expect that you've been active building your platform.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. So there's a question about author rights, depending on whether or not they're self-published or traditional. Can you tell what the biggest issues are between those two?
So knowing what your rights are?
Yes, yes, as an author.
So I think a lot of writers think of their book as a story that's printed on paper and wrapped in a cover or delivered electronically. Publishers look at your book as a whole laundry list of rights, even everything down to merchandising. Like, what if somebody wants to make a plushie of your main character? That's going to be in your publishing contract. Audio rights, condensation rights, abridgment rights, book club rights, first serial, second serial, all of the translation into hundreds of other languages. So all of these different rights are going to be negotiated independently of each other when your agent is negotiating your contract. And those are all revenue streams for you. So knowing that your book is more than just a story wrapped in a cover is the place to start, I think. And then also understanding if you're going independent, or if you're even going with a small press who doesn't require you to have an agent, and this would be a whole other box of frogs we don't have time to open here, but you want to understand that the contract they present you is going to favor them. So knowing what to negotiate and what to ask for. And a lot of writers are going to be like, I don't want to ask for anything because I don't want them to not want to publish me. I just want my book published. But I have so many horror stories, guys, authors who are so enthusiastic to sign a contract that they sign away rights to their entire future career, rights to those characters, rights to those worlds. So know your contracts. And you can hire independent publishing attorneys to review your contracts for you if you don't have an agent. So don't hesitate to do that. It's an investment, but it's your career. So protect yourself.
Excellent, thank you. Any other thoughts, guys? No? Okay. I do have a question about, they call it in this little mashup, but I think what they're talking about is like the elevator speech. You know, how important is it as an author for them to have that down?
So like your elevator pitch.
Yeah,
Again,
yeah.
in case you're in an elevator with an agent, which does happen at conferences. And it's basically, you know, when you pitch your story, being able to just talk about it within a minute or two. And it's also very similar to what goes in your query letter. It's very important, but I think, you may disagree, Angie, I think it gets a little overemphasized on how polished it needs to be. You need to be able to talk about your book with, I mean, you know it better than anyone else, so that's already a plus. You need to be able to condense it and speak about it eloquently, but having, you know, your memorized 30-second pitch ready at all times seems a little less important to me than just being able to talk about it with enthusiasm and passion.
Excellent, thank you.
I'd agree. I think it's a little off-putting when somebody comes to deliver a pitch, if I'm doing pitch appointments at a conference, and they deliver the pitch entirely like this, and it's 100% memorized. And then I'm like, whoa. But yeah, it is a lot more fun on both sides of the table if it's more of just a conversation about your book, and then I can ask you questions about it, and we can just have a chat. So I agree that it's a little overemphasized, the importance of the pitch.
Yeah, I'm always a little bit scared of the person who insists on telling me line by line exactly the entire plot. So they need to be able to edit it down.
Good point. Yeah.
And I would say practice like you were going to a backyard barbecue or a cocktail party. And, you know, you're talking about what you do and you mention, oh, I've written a book. And they say, oh, what's it about? Well, don't make it so long that they're eyeing over here and say, oh, it's great, there's somebody over here I need to talk to, excuse me. So try to keep it short and succinct and keep it to the main plot and don't feel you have to, we don't want to blow by blow. You know, and so be able to say it that way. And also in all of your marketing kit and your media kit, you know, have several versions of your bio and your description of your book for different occasions like that. And I totally agree, it should not be so rote and so over-rehearsed that it sounds like a robot's doing it. But yeah, it's worth practicing so that it comes out naturally and enthusiastically.
Excellent. Well, we started a little early, but so it looks like we're going to end a little early with one last question. So what's your best don't do this example?
You have so many. You start.
I'm trying to think of, there are so many. Okay, speaking to, you know, when you're published on Amazon and you really haven't done a whole lot of preparation, I got a call from a woman who, after she emailed me, she called me, whose cover was entirely blank. And so I'm looking at the front, the back, this is on Amazon. And the description for the book said, a spine-tingling suspense novel. And so when she called me, I said, why don't you have a description of the book? And she said, well, I don't want to give the plot away. And I said, okay, first thing you need to do is do a professional cover. And she said, well, I thought we were going to talk about marketing. And I said, this is marketing. So my big, don't is, don't do that. Take the time to learn what it takes to put a good book together.
Thank you. Anyone else want to jump in?
I think this might have come up a little bit along the way, but getting ahead of yourself or getting in a hurry before you really need to. If you're looking for an agent and you get your agent and the agent gets you your book deal, then you got to start worrying about time and you've got to really get things moving. But I have a lot of people tell me, well, an agent told me at a conference that she's interested in my book and I should send it in the next 2 months. And so I say, well, okay, so where are you in the process? Well, I'm almost done with the first draft. And I look at it and I say, this is a fairly solid first draft. It's not going to be ready in 2 months to send to the agent. And so this idea that agents are sitting there waiting for the book that they heard about at this conference, when they actually heard about 35, 40 other books that day, make it as perfect as you can do. Make the best book you can possibly do, and then start worrying about getting it out there really fast. But putting the cart before the horse is the biggest mistake I see.
And I would add, act with integrity. The industry is a lot smaller than you might think it is, and authors can kind of find ways to game the system a little bit, like, oh, I can say that I have an offer of representation from another agent, and that means that all of the agents on my list are going to read my book immediately, and I can fast forward myself to the front of the slush pile. We catch people doing that who don't actually have other offers of representation. Agents all know each other, and they all talk. So you can get yourself kind of in a nasty situation the minute you kind of try to game the system or you claim that someone referred you. We get a lot of false referrals. We will check up on stuff like that. So be honest, be cool. You don't have to respond to rejections with nastiness. We've got a lot of stories. My favorite rejection response was, I hope you all die of cancer, you fat cows. So yeah, kind of fun.
I had a couple of those where, people know me as really mild-mannered, but there were a couple of those while I was reading the slush pile that I was like, all right, Angie, stop me. Delete this before I respond.
Yeah. So
Have you been tempted to put those on Facebook or something?
yeah, it's hard not to because
Yeah.
you just want to be like, come on, guys, be cool. So yeah, and also don't feed the trolls on your Twitter. And after you're published and you get the nasty 1-star review because they bought book 2 instead of book 1 in their series and didn't realize, so 1 star for you, don't engage. Don't engage.
No.
More often than not, you're just going to want to backpedal and keep it zip.
Fantastic. Well, I'd like to thank our panelists once more and the audience for the great questions. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.